The funeral of Sir Alister Pennington had concluded with the damp solemnity peculiar to English villages, the mourners dispersing beneath a sky the colour of old pewter. Black umbrellas folded, car doors closed softly, and polite murmurs of grief faded into the hedgerows. Yet within an hour of the final prayer, death returned to Greystone Manor, uninvited and infinitely more perplexing than the one just laid to rest. It was Miss Violet Marsh, Sir Alister's cousin and sole companion in his final years, who discovered the second body. She had gone to the house, East Wing, to retrieve legal papers requested by the solicitor, her footsteps echoing in corridors still heavy with the scent of lilies. When she opened the door to the study, she screamed once, short, sharp, and precise, like the crack of a pistol. Charles Pennington, Sir Alister's nephew and heir, lay slumped in the armchair behind the massive oak desk. His head lolled to one side, his lips faintly blue, his eyes staring with mild surprise rather than terror. A glass of port rested on the desk beside him, untouched, and the fire in the grate had burned low but steady. The windows were shut and latched from the inside. The door through which Miss Marsh had entered was the only entrance, and it had been locked. Dr. Hammond arrived swiftly, summoned from the village. After a brief examination, he declared Charles dead, estimating the time of death at no more than 20 minutes earlier. Poison, most likely, though there were no immediate signs of struggle or distress. The port smelled and tasted entirely normal. No vial, no powder, no suspicious residue could be found in the room. The household was small and, on that day, meticulously accounted for. Miss Marsh had been with the solicitor in the drawing-room. The butler, Graves, had been clearing luncheon service in the dining-room, assisted by the young maid, Elsie. Mrs. Pennington, Charles, his wife, had retired upstairs, pleading a headache brought on by grief. No one had entered or left the study since Charles himself had gone there to rest, claiming fatigue after the burial. The police arrived, examined, questioned, frowned, and examined again. They found nothing. The study was a locked room in the strictest sense, its windows unbroken, its fireplace too narrow and choked with ash to admit even a child. The key to the study door was found in Charles's own pocket. The glass of port bore no fingerprints beyond his own. The bottle from which it had been poured stood in the decanter cabinet, untouched since morning. Then there was the envelope. It lay half-hidden beneath a stack of correspondence on the desk, unsealed and apparently insignificant. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing only 3 words, written in a careful, old-fashioned hand, after the funeral. The phrase meant little and seemed almost theatrical, as if intended to mislead. Miss Marsh swore she had never seen it before. Mrs. Pennington denied any knowledge of it, though her voice trembled when she spoke. The solicitor suggested it might be a note regarding Sir Alister's will, misplaced and misunderstood. The police logged it dutifully and set it aside, for it explained nothing and accused no one. By evening, the manor was cloaked in an uneasy quiet. The villagers whispered of curses and family feuds. The police departed, promising to return, their expressions strained with irritation at a crime that refused to behave sensibly. It was then, as twilight softened the edges of Greystone Manor, that a small man with an immaculate moustache arrived in a hired motor car. Hercule Poirot listened as the facts were presented to him, his dark eyes alert, his fingertips pressed together. He asked few questions at first, preferring to observe the position of the chair, the angle of the body, the faint draught that stirred the curtains despite the closed windows. When shown the envelope, he smiled, not with amusement, but with recognition. "Ah," he murmured softly, "this crime, it announces itself as impossible. That is always most considerate. It tells me at once that it is, in fact, very simple." He replaced the paper on the desk exactly where it had been found and turned to Miss Marsh. "Madame," he said gently, "you will permit me to attend not one funeral but 2, and I think, if we are very attentive, the second will explain the first." Poirot remained in the study long after the others had withdrawn, the hush of evening settling into the walls like a held breath. He did not touch the body again, nor the glass, nor the papers on the desk. Instead, he walked slowly, almost delicately, about the room, as though pacing the perimeter of a thought rather than a space. His eyes travelled from the latch on the window to the rug beneath the armchair, from the cold hearth to the line of books, shelved with almost military precision, Order, he murmured. So much order. It is always suspicious. Inspector Jameson, a conscientious man with a habit of clearing his throat before speaking, hovered nearby. He had explained the official position once more. Locked room, no weapon, no intruder, no motive sufficiently dramatic to warrant murder. Poirot nodded politely, absorbing the words while studying something far smaller, a faint semicircle on the polished desk, barely visible unless the light struck it just so. "Inspector," Poirot said at last, "you observe this mark?" Jameson leaned closer. "Ring from a glass, I should think, just so." "And yet," Poirot's finger hovered, not touching, "the glass is here, placed upon a blotter. That ring was made when the glass was set elsewhere, directly on the wood. Earlier, perhaps, or by someone who wished us to think it earlier." Jameson frowned, making a note. Poirot turned his attention to the armchair. Its right arm bore the slightest indentation, as though something narrow and firm had rested there for some minutes. Not a hand, not a book. Poirot straightened, smoothing his moustache, and glanced toward the door. Miss Violet Marsh stood there, pale but composed, her hands folded with determined neatness. She answered Poirot's questions readily, perhaps too readily. Yes, Charles had seemed tired after the funeral. Yes, he had poured himself a glass of port. No, she had not spoken to him alone that afternoon. Her eyes did not waver, but her foot shifted just once when Poirot asked about the envelope. "After the funeral," Poirot repeated softly. A curious phrase. It suggests anticipation, does it not? As though someone had planned an event to follow so closely upon the ceremony that the two would blur together. Miss Marsh inclined her head. "Families often settle matters after funerals, Monsieur Poirot. Indeed, money, inheritance, the settling of accounts." He smiled gently. "And resentments." Mrs. Pennington was less composed. When Poirot met her upstairs, she lay upon a chaise, one gloved hand pressed theatrically to her temple. She wept easily, but answered vaguely, insisting she had heard nothing, seen nothing, known nothing. Yet when Poirot mentioned the time of death, her tears faltered. "So soon," she whispered. I assumed, it must have been later." Poirot bowed slightly and withdrew, his expression thoughtful. Downstairs, the servants were gathered in the kitchen, their whispers dying as he entered. Graves the butler stood rigid, offended by the very notion of disorder. Elsie, the maid, stared at the floor, twisting her apron. Poirot asked simple questions. Who had served the port that afternoon? Graves had prepared the decanter in the morning, as always. Who had access to it? Anyone in theory. Poirot nodded, then asked something else seemingly unrelated. "Tell me, mademoiselle," he said to Elsie, "why did you polish the silver twice today?" Her head jerked up. I didn't, sir." "But you did," Poirot said gently. "I see the cloth still damp in the pantry. You were nervous. Something made your hands shake." She glanced at Graves, then back at Poirot. "I was told to," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Mrs. Pennington said it must look perfect. After the funeral—" Again the phrase. Again the tightening of the room around it. Later, alone once more in the study, Poirot examined the fire. Among the ash lay the curled remnant of paper, burned hastily, incompletely. He coaxed it free with a poker, revealing a fragment of inked script. Too little to read, but enough to know it had been written recently. The poison, Poirot reflected, was not the mystery. Poison was easy. Opportunity, too, was easy in a house heavy with grief. What interested him was timing. Death arranged to occur when all eyes were elsewhere, when sorrow provided camouflage, when suspicion would scatter instead of focus. From the hallway came the muted sounds of voices, of nerves stretched thin. Poirot smiled faintly. Someone in this house had believed the funeral to be an ending. They were mistaken. It was merely the prelude. The drawing-room became Poirot's chosen arena, its high-backed chairs arranged in a loose semicircle that suggested conversation rather than interrogation. The fire had been revived, and its glow lent warmth to faces that otherwise might have appeared merely pale. Poirot preferred it so. People revealed more when they believed themselves at ease. Inspector Jameson remained nearby, notebook in hand, while the household assembled one by one. Poirot began not with accusations but with time, asking each person to recount the afternoon as they remembered it. from the moment the funeral procession returned to Greystone Manor until the scream in the study shattered the calm. Miss Violet Marsh spoke first. Her account was precise, almost clipped. She had accompanied the solicitor to the drawing-room to review documents related to Sir Alister's estate. They spoke of legal technicalities, nothing more. Charles had excused himself shortly after their return, complaining of fatigue. She had not seen him again until she found his body. Her voice did not falter, but Poirot noticed how carefully she avoided naming the inheritance directly, as though the word itself were dangerous. Mrs. Pennington followed, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She described retiring upstairs immediately after luncheon, overwhelmed by grief and a headache. She insisted she had heard no footsteps, no voices, no disturbance of any kind. Yet when Poirot asked whether she had seen her husband drink the port, she hesitated. "I assumed he would," she said slowly. "He always did, after occasions." "Assumptions," Poirot murmured. "They are so often the enemies of truth." Graves, the butler, delivered his testimony with wounded dignity. He had prepared the port in the morning, as was customary, and placed the decanter in the cabinet. He had served luncheon, cleared the table, and spent the afternoon attending to routine duties. No one unusual had entered the study. No one had requested anything out of the ordinary. Poirot thanked him and asked, almost as an afterthought, whether the decanter had been moved. Graves stiffened. "Not to my knowledge, sir. Yet the cabinet door was ajar," Poirot said mildly. "A small thing, perhaps, but doors do not open themselves." Elsie spoke last, her words tumbling out. A rush. She had been in the dining-room with Graves, then in the pantry. She had seen Mrs. Pennington pass the foot of the stairs once, earlier than she had claimed. When Mrs. Pennington protested, Elsie flushed and looked at the floor. "I might be mistaken," she said quickly. "It was only a moment. A moment is often enough," Poirot said gently. As the questioning continued, small fractures appeared. Miss Marsh recalled the solicitor leaving earlier than he remembered. Graves insisted the fire in the study had been lit by Charles himself, yet could not say when he had last checked it. Mrs. Pennington contradicted herself about the time of her headache, first saying it began after luncheon, then before. Poirot listened, his head tilted, his fingers steepled. He was less interested in the lies themselves than in their shape. Some were clumsy, born of fear. Others were polished, rehearsed. One, he noted, was conspicuously absent. When the solicitor was summoned back into the room, he seemed surprised to be included. His account was straightforward. Legal discussions, a brief disagreement over a codicil to the will, nothing more. Poirot seized upon the word. "Disagreement," he repeated. "With whom?" "With Sir Alister originally, and by extension with Charles." He was disappointed. "Disappointed men," Poirot said softly, "often seek redress, but not always with violence." The room grew quieter as understanding began to dawn, not of the solution but of the stakes. Each person there had wanted something: money, security, control, release. The funeral had gathered them like moths around a flame, and afterward something had burned. Poirot rose and paced slowly before the fire. "You have all told me your stories," he said. "They cannot all be true. Some of you speak too much, some too little. But there is one thing you share. You all believe the death occurred when Charles drank the port." He turned, his gaze settling briefly on each face. "I am not yet convinced of that." A murmur rippled through the room. Inspector Jameson looked up sharply. Poirot smiled, a small, knowing curve of the lips. "The voices of this house," he continued, "they whisper of preparation, not impulse, of actions taken after the funeral, but decisions made before it ever began." No one spoke. In the silence, Poirot could almost hear the click of a mechanism winding tighter. Somewhere among them the truth was waiting, impatient now, and ready at last to be revealed. Poirot allowed the room to empty slowly, watching each person depart as though committing their silhouettes to memory. When the last footstep faded, he turned to Inspector Jameson, who had been uncharacteristically silent. "You see now," Poirot said, "the difficulty. Each of them could have desired this death. And yet desire alone does not kill so neatly." Jameson exhaled. "They all stand to gain something. Miss Marsh inherits if the will is contested. Mrs. Pennington gains independence and money. Even the servants might benefit from a change in household." "Ah," Poirot replied, wagging a finger. "But benefit is not the same as motive. Motive is personal. It has teeth. He began with Miss Violet Marsh. She was intelligent, capable, and quietly resentful of Charles, who had inherited both title and fortune despite contributing little to Sir Alister's later years. The solicitor confirmed there had been tension over the estate, and that Miss Marsh had argued, passionately, for a scientific trust to be funded from it. Yet Poirot noted that she had not pressed her advantage when Sir Alister was alive. Patience, yes. Desperation, no. And above all, she had no clear opportunity to reach the study unnoticed. Mrs. Pennington's motives were more obvious and more volatile. Her marriage had been polite wrath, than affectionate, and rumours, never substantiated, hinted at her dissatisfaction. She had money to gain and freedom to secure. Yet Poirot found her ill-suited to the method. Poison required calm foresight and precision. Mrs. Pennington's lies were emotional, reactive, full of cracks. Fear, yes. Calculation, perhaps not enough. Graves the butler presented a different puzzle. Loyalty to Sir Alister was unquestioned, but his relationship with Charles had been strained. Charles had spoken of modernizing the household, of reducing staff. Fear, then, could be motive enough. Graves had access to everything, knew every habit, every cupboard. And yet Poirot hesitated. The butler's orderliness bordered on ritual. Murder for him would have been an act of chaos. Poirot could not reconcile the two. Elsie, trembling and young, seemed the least likely of all. She knew little of wills and less of poison. But she knew the house, and she knew what she had seen. Poirot suspected her fear came not from guilt, but from being too close to something she did not understand. One by one, Poirot aligned the motives with the means and the opportunities, and each time the pieces slid just slightly out of place. No single thread ran cleanly from desire to deed. The maze was deliberate. Someone had wanted the truth to tangle. He returned to the study alone, closing the door softly behind him. The armchair seemed to wait, its silence accusatory. Poirot examined it again, then the desk, then the floor beneath. His gaze settled on the small indentation on the chair's arm, and this time he measured it with care. A syringe, he murmured, or something very like it. If the poison had not been in the port, then Charles might have been dosed earlier, perhaps before the funeral, perhaps even during it. A delayed poison would explain everything: the locked room, the untouched glass, the convenient assu. Emptions. Death would arrive after the funeral, just as the note promised. But who would know enough to choose such a poison? Who would anticipate the timing so precisely? Poirot thought again of the solicitor, of the codicil, of the burned paper in the grate. A document destroyed in haste was more dangerous than any vial. He retrieved the fragment once more, studying the ink pattern, the margin width. It was legal paper, he said softly, and it frightened someone. The web tightened. The murder was not merely about inheritance, nor jealousy, nor fear, but about control of the narrative. Someone had arranged matters so that when Sir Alister was buried, the truth would be buried with him. Charles, inconveniently, had survived long enough to become a problem. Footsteps approached in the corridor. Poirot straightened, his expression serene once more. The motives were many, overlapping like shadows at dusk, but now he could see their outlines, and where they intersected. The maze, he knew, always had a centre, and he was very close to finding it. The morning sun fell obliquely across the study, catching the flecks of dust that hung like motes in the air. Inspector Jameson, brimming with the sense of duty and relief, presented Poirot with the evidence they believed decisive. A small vial, found hidden behind the decanter cabinet, contained traces of digitalis, the same slow-acting poison suspected in Charles's death. The butler had claimed ignorance, but the physical proof seemed irrefutable. "This, monsieur," Jameson said, holding the vial with gloved hands, "confirms our suspicions. Someone with access to the study and knowledge of Charles's habits administered the poison. Given the position of the decanter and the timing, the culprit could only have been the butler, Graves. He had motive, access, and opportunity. Case closed." Poirot listened politely, his dark eyes, fixed on the small glass. He nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. "Ah, oui, the evidence is convincing. Très convaincant indeed. Yet, my friend, conviction is not truth. It is merely plausible." Jameson frowned. "Plausible?" The vial matches the autopsy, the timing aligns, the servant has no alibi. Surely you do not doubt it." Poirot tapped the floor lightly with his cane. "I doubt nothing, I observe everything. And there is a difference. Let us suppose, for argument's sake, that Graves is guilty. Then the matter is simple. But if we examine the scene as a whole, a subtle discord appears." "What discord?" Jameson asked, irritation threading his voice. "The placement of the decanter," Poirot explained, moving to the sideboard. "It was returned to the cabinet, yes? But notice this, fingerprints only on the neck of the bottle, not on the body of the decanter. That suggests handling with care, almost theatrical care. A hurried servant does not handle bottles thus. He pours and leaves. This is performed." Jameson opened his mouth, but Poirot continued. "And the armchair, indentation on the arm, yet the glass was untouched. Poison may have been in the port, yet it does not match the body placement. Something is staged." The inspector shook his head. "Then what? You would have us release a suspect while a murderer walks free?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Mais oui. One does not close a case because it looks tidy. The truth is rarely tidy. Meanwhile, within the household, the early accusation had spread. Mrs. Pennington's eyes flickered with cautious relief. Miss Marsh's composure remained firm, and even Elsie straightened slightly, as though a small burden had lifted. The world seemed momentarily restored to order. Graves, rigid as ever, protested his innocence vigorously, but few doubted the authorities' conclusion. Poirot, however, refused to participate in the celebrati. On of a false victory. He returned to the study, crouching beside the embers of the hearth where the fragment of burned paper had been recovered. Picking up a small, charred piece, he examined the careful slant of the handwriting, the precise spacing, the deliberate wording. Whoever had burned this was meticulous, too meticulous to be the impulsive Graves, too deliberate to leave such a clue to chance. A draught stirred the curtains, and Poirot's gaze fell on the slight gap in the window-sill, hardly noticeable. A thread of dust disturbed along the edge suggested someone had leaned there recently, someone slender, perhaps nimble, and acutely aware of timing. The hand that committed this act had not been clumsy. It had been deliberate, and it had vanished before suspicion could settle. Poirot's mind traced the sequence, the funeral, the careful timing of Charles's death, the staged port, the strategic exposure of evidence, all choreographed to mislead. Someone had orchestrated the false trail, allowing the authorities to claim closure while the true criminal observed, invisible, waiting for the next opportunity. Confident in the belief that all eyes were elsewhere, a faint knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Elsie appeared, her face pale but earnest. "Monsieur Poirot, I thought you should know. Mrs. Pennington asked me to prepare a note for the solicitor. She said it might be urgent." Poirot inclined his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Urgent, or a distraction?" The maid hesitated, sensing the weight behind the question, but nodded. Poirot set aside the fragment of paper, his mind already spinning threads of possibility. The victory claimed by the police was superficial, a convenient resolution, yet the pulse of truth still beat beneath the surface, unseen but insistent. Somewhere in the manor, the real architect of death lingered, patient and calculating. And Poirot, as always, would wait for the smallest, almost imperceptible clue to unravel the final hidden design. Poirot sat in the quiet of the study, the fading glow of the fireplace reflecting off the polished wood, and allowed his mind to drift back, past the funeral, past Charles's death, even past the household as it now stood. He considered the ledger again, the faint traces of ink on charred fragments, and the subtle echoes of old grudges that seemed to pulse through the manor. Something had been overlooked, buried not in plain sight, but in the recesses of memory and circumstance. He recalled a case from years ago, a minor dispute between two branches of the Pennington family over a failed shipment of rare silks from abroad, handled then by the same solicitor who now managed Sir Alister's estate. At the time, the case had seemed trivial, settled quietly, barely remembered. But there it was again, faintly referenced in the ledger, as a debt carried forward under a different name. Miss Violet Marsh's mother had been involved, a sister to one of the claimants, and the ledger revealed payments that were incomplete, obligations that had lingered like shadows. The present generation, Charles, Mrs. Pennington, even Violet herself, were caught in the lingering consequences, mostly unaware of the debts that had quietly persisted. Poirot's gaze shifted to the envelope, the single phrase, "after the funeral." Its simplicity had seemed theatrical, almost playful, yet it now struck him as pointedly deliberate. Someone who knew the household, the family's history, and the exact sensitivities of its members had timed everything precisely. The death was not merely murder. It was the continuation of unfinished business, revenge for wrongs no longer visible on the surface, but still powerful. He began to connect the threads. Miss Marsh, outwardly calm and measured, had a personal stake. That extended far beyond the inheritance. She was the living link to the past injustice, to debts denied and promises unfulfilled. Charles's oversight, his flippant treatment of family history and accounts, had triggered old resentments. Mrs. Pennington, intelligent and calculating, had her own motivations entwined with this past: financial security, social standing, the ability to control the narrative after Sir Alister's death. Even Graves, faithful as he appeared, had been witness to decades of grudges and unspoken rules, forced to navigate loyalties that had been shaped by events long forgotten. Poirot examined the subtle signs, the armchair indentation, the carefully staged decanter, the port untouched, the faint marks on the study floor. All were evidence of deliberate choreography. The murderer had orchestrated the scene to mislead, to direct suspicion toward the obvious, while the real influence lay elsewhere. Each participant, consciously or unconsciously, played a part in this drama, shaped by debts, obligations, and resentments that had persisted through time. A sudden recollection struck Poirot, the solicitor himself. He had been involved in settling the old case, in monitoring the fulfillment of debts, and now he had returned, conveniently present at the funeral, conveniently departing before Charles's death. His movements had been precise, almost ceremonial. Was he a guardian of old family balances, ensuring some debts remained unpaid while others were claimed? Or had he been manipulated, used as a tool by someone with deeper knowledge of the family's entangled history? Poirot smiled faintly, aware that the web extended further than anyone realized. The crime was not merely a reaction to the present moment, but a culmination of long-forgotten slights, unfinished transactions, and hidden promises. The murder of Charles was not simply an act of greed or pass. Ion. It was the punctuation mark on a story that began decades earlier, one that had wound its way silently through generations, shaping loyalties and animosities alike. He rose and walked to the window, peering into the grounds where shadows lengthened beneath the twilight. Somewhere in the house, the true orchestrator lingered, confident in their secrecy, watching the layers of deception unfold as planned. But Poirot now held the map to that labyrinth of motives and connections. He understood how the past had bent the present to its will, and he knew that the smallest, most overlooked details would guide him to the final revelation. The shadows of history were long and intricate, but even they could be illuminated by careful observation, patient thought, and an understanding of human nature. Poirot felt the familiar thrill. The hidden pattern was coming into view. And when it did, the truth, rooted in both past and present, would emerge undeniable and complete. Poirot returned to the drawing-room in the early evening, the soft glow of lamps casting gentle shadows across the furniture. The household had settled into a fragile quiet, though under that calm lay the tension of the unresolved case. He had already traced the labyrinth of past grievances, mapped the overlapping motives, and observed the meticulously orchestrated staging of the crime. Yet something still eluded him, a subtle misalignment, an almost invisible thread that would betray the mind behind the murder. He decided to employ a method he reserved for such delicate situations, the unconventional clue. Not evidence in the usual sense, not fingerprints or traces of poison, but a psychological test, a gentle probe into the character of those who had so carefully concealed their intentions. He summoned the household one by one, but first requested that they participate in a small exercise, a harmless-seeming experiment. "Mes amis," he began, his hands clasped behind his back. "We shall play a little game. It is not a test of intellect, but of attentiveness and honesty. I shall read a series of brief statements. I wish only that you respond with your natural reaction, without thought, without preparation. Yes or no will suffice." The room stiffened, curiosity mingling with apprehension. Poirot continued, observing carefully. "First, do you believe everyone tells the truth?" A murmur, polite smiles. "Second, is it ever necessary to act to protect one's own interests?" Eyes flicked momentarily, then returned to him. "Third, if a secret were to remain hidden, could it justify extraordinary measures?" It was then, on the third statement, that he noticed the subtle change. Mrs. Pennington's hands, previously folded neatly, clenched for a moment in the folds of her lap. Her breath caught, and she coloured slightly. A slip, almost imperceptible, but to Poirot's trained eye, revealing more than words could. Miss Marsh remained perfectly composed, her gaze steady, but a fleeting hesitation betrayed a thought carefully weighed before permitting it to surface. Graves and Elsie showed no visible reaction, yet Poirot noted the micro-expressions, slight tightening around the eyes, subtle pursing of lips, each revealing a private calculus. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, watching Mrs. Pennington, noting how her fingers relaxed once she realized she had been observed. "Ah," he said softly, almost to himself, "there is the crack. One need not speak to reveal a mind's interior." He shifted tactics slightly, employing another unconventional method. He requested each person to recount, in casual conversation, the events of the afternoon of Charles's death, emphasizing the order of minor, seemingly irrelevant details, the position of chairs, the precise pouring of the port, the timing of footsteps. Most repeated their previous accounts dutifully. Mrs. Pennington's version, however, wavered subtly. Her emphasis shifted unconsciously, her description of Charles's actions slightly inconsistent with prior testimony. A fleeting anxiety appeared whenever she mentioned the handling of the decanter. Poirot leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers once more. He had not sought confession, he had not asked for admissions, yet in the reactions, in the discrepancies between instinct and artifice, the truth had begun to surface. The murderer's mind could not fully suppress its impulses, its careful choreography occasionally betraying the underlying intention. A sudden idea struck him. He asked Mrs. Pennington to join him at the desk in the study, under the pretense of examining some documents. As she bent to pick up a paper, Poirot's keen eyes noted a faint residue on her glove, slight traces of powder, almost invisible unless the angle of light caught it just so. The glove, she claimed, had been handled with care during the funeral preparations, but Poirot had already observed that Elsie had not touched that desk. Graves had been elsewhere, and Miss Marsh had no reason to approach it during that time. The combination of the psychological cues, the fleeting tremor, the hesitation, the inconsistent storytelling, and the physical trace formed a pattern. Poirot smiled inwardly. It was subtle, almost theatrical, yet undeniable. The unconventional clue, the response of a mind under scrutiny, the instinctual reveal of guilt, had exposed a fissure in the carefully constructed facade. He allowed Mrs. Pennington to return to the room with the others, her demeanor still composed, yet now shadowed by the faintest tremor of uncertainty. Poirot rose, tapping his cane lightly. The threads were aligning. The past had informed the present, motives intertwined with history, and hidden manipulations of character were emerging. Soon, he reflected, the house would no longer be a theatre of shadows. The orchestrator of death, revealed through the subtlest of signs, would finally be confronted with the undeniable truth. The evening had deepened into a sombre stillness at Greystone Manor, the flicker of lamps casting shadows that stretched along the walls like dark fingers. Poirot had spent hours piecing together the subtle inconsistencies, tracing motives to long-forgotten grievances, and observing reactions that betrayed the slightest tremor of conscience. The investigation had begun to yield a coherent thread, one that might finally unravel the careful deception that had cloaked Charles Pennington's death. And yet, as he prepared to document his observations for Inspector Jameson, an unsettling disturbance made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. The study, which had remained locked and undisturbed since the discovery of the body, now seemed different. A faint scent of smoke lingered in the air, almost imperceptible. Poirot approached the fireplace, where he had previously recovered the charred fragments of the burned note. With careful hands, he noticed that the remnants were gone, completely vanished, as though they had never existed. His heart, usually measured, quickened slightly. Someone had removed them. He turned sharply. the sound startling in the quiet room, and spotted the faintest disturbance along the edge of the rug. A smear, a subtle imprint that suggested hurried footsteps. He knelt, examining the floor, noting the direction of the marks. They led to the sideboard, then out of the study entirely. Someone had entered after his last visit and taken the fragments, deliberately erasing the evidence that could have tied the present to the past so clearly. Poirot's mind raced, weaving possibilities. The destruction was intention. Meticulous, and designed to mislead. Whoever had done this was not merely clever. They were desperate to conceal the connections he had begun to illuminate. It was an act meant to protect a carefully constructed facade, to remove the thread that linked motive, opportunity, and historical grievance. Inspector Jameson arrived promptly, summoned by the subtle commotion Poirot had allowed to be observed. The inspector's expression darkened when he saw the empty hearth. "Stolen, destroyed, after all this work?" he asked, incredulity clear in his voice. Poirot nodded, steepling his fingers. "Oui, mon ami." The evidence was vanishing, leaving only whispers behind. "We must now be most vigilant. Whoever seeks to bury the truth knows our intentions. They will act again should they feel the need." The household, already tense, seemed to pulse with heightened anxiety when the news spread. Miss Marsh maintained her composure, but her eyes flickered with faint worry. Mrs. Pennington, previously calm under Poirot's subtle psychological tests, now shifted in her chair, a slight tension visible in her hands. Even Graves, who prided himself on order and predictability, appeared unsettled, glancing repeatedly toward the study door as if expecting it to open at any moment. Poirot considered the implications. The vanishing of the note fragments did more than remove physical evidence. It tested the loyalty and composure of the household. Whoever had committed this act was sending a message. The truth would not be easily unearthed, and any investigation must contend with deliberate interference. It was a move that required careful calculation and courage, or perhaps audacity, and the perpetrator had both in abundance. He returned to the scene, examining the desk and its surroundings with renewed attention. The faint residue on Mrs. Pennington's gloves, the indentation in the armchair, the placement of the decanter. All these subtle clues now carried an added urgency. The person who removed the note fragments would be closely connected to the central orchestration of the crime, and their actions had revealed both recklessness and fear. Poirot walked slowly toward the door, glancing back at the empty hearth. "Trust, mon ami," he said to Jameson, "is now a fragile thing. Every movement must be observed, every word weighed. The criminal believes themselves unseen, but impatience often betrays even the most careful." As the two men left the study, the manor felt heavier, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the tension and were holding their breath. Poirot knew that the vanishing evidence had raised the stakes, forcing the investigation into a delicate dance, with someone who was watching, waiting, and willing to act again to protect their secrets. The truth remained within reach, yet the shadows had grown longer, and the path to revelation now required greater precision, patience, and vigilance than ever before. The manor seemed to hold its breath that night, each corridor thick with shadow, each room resonant with the faint echoes of past conversations. Poirot had retired to his quarters with only a faint sense of unease, a quiet certainty that the vanishing of the note fragments had not been an isolated act, but a signal of the murderer's awareness. He had barely set down his papers when a sharp, panicked knock sounded at the door. It was Elsie, the maid, her face pale and trembling. "Monsieur Poirot, it's Mrs. Pennington. I went to call her for dinner, and she's gone. Her room is empty, and the window, it's open." Poirot rose immediately, his mind already racing. The window, small and narrow, would not easily admit an adult without effort, but the trace on the sill, the faint scratch along the polished wood, suggested deliberate use. He followed Elsie through the darkened hallways, noting the subtle signs of forced movement, a slightly askew chair in the corridor, the faint trace of a slipper against the carpet leading to the window. The air was sharp, carrying a scent of cold and smoke. Smoke perhaps from a hastily burned letter, perhaps from something else entirely. Inspector Jameson joined them moments later, breathless from the run. "She's missing! But why would she leave, or be taken?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Mon ami, we are observing now the very audacity of the criminal, the one who stole the fragments, who manipulated the household, who orchestrated a death after the funeral, now strikes again. This is no longer about concealment, it is about control. The study, once again examined, revealed nothing new, save for a small smear of residue on the desk, faintly visible in the lamplight, perhaps overlooked in previous inspections. Poirot touched it gingerly with his handkerchief. The substance was consistent with the poison used earlier, though in negligible quantity. A warning, he thought. The murderer had tested him, observed his methods, and now issued a challenge. The game was not yet over. He gathered the household in the drawing-room, each person's face etched with alarm. Miss Marsh's composure remained, yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. Graves, rigid as ever, appeared increasingly nervous, glancing repeatedly at the locked doors. Elsie clutched her apron tightly, her hands trembling. Poirot observed all, noting their posture, their hesitation, their instinctive glances toward places of concealment. He did not speak immediately. He allowed the tension to stretch, letting each of them reveal themselves through the smallest, unconscious cues. Then, almost imperceptibly, a realization struck him. Mrs. Pennington's disappearance, the tampering with evidence, the subtle provocations, all indicated a mind that thrived on manipulation and foresight. Whoever was behind this did not merely respond to events, they orchestrated them, anticipating the reactions of others, even the interventions of law enforcement. The murderer was several steps ahead, calculating the next moves with a chilling precision. Poirot's voice finally broke the silence. The crime is evolving, mes amis, and in evolution one sees the signature of intelligence, patience, and boldness. The disappearance of Mrs. Pennington is not merely an accident. It is a demonstration, an assertion of control. The villain wishes to unsettle us, to mislead, to provoke panic while remaining invisible. He turned to Jameson. We must act quickly, observe, contain, anticipate. The next move may be decisive, and the life of the lady, perhaps more than one, may depend upon our vigilance. The criminal has shown capability for murder, for manipulation, for concealment. Now they wish to see how we respond. The tension was nearly tangible. A wire stretched taut across the manor. Poirot's mind, ever methodical, traced every possibility, hidden passages, secret communications, opportunities for concealment. He noted how each room might provide cover, how each servant's duties could be observed, how each family member's habits could be manipulated. And at the center of this complex chessboard was the villain, patient and calculating, confident in their ability to stay one step ahead. Poirot's eyes swept the room, lingering on Miss Marsh and then Graves, then Elsie, before settling on the empty space once occupied by Mrs. Pennington. The patterns were emerging. He could sense the rhythm of the criminal's mind, the cadence of their movements. But this was no longer merely a puzzle to solve. It was a race against time, a challenge to prevent another act before it was too late. And Poirot, with all his powers of observation and deduction, felt the familiar thrill of pursuit, sharpened now by the urgency of imminent danger. Poirot stood quietly in the drawing-room. The household gathered tensely around him, each person uncertain of what he might reveal. The disappearance of Mrs. Pennington, the stolen fragments, the earlier poisoning, all of it had seemed chaotic, a storm of events without rhyme or reason. Yet Poirot's mind, as always, worked in silence, tracing connections that others could not perceive, threading together subtle inconsistencies like fine silk into a tapestry of understanding. It was a small detail, barely noticed amid the upheaval, that first drew his attention. A faint, almost imperceptible smear of wax on the edge of the study desk, near the place where Mrs. Pennington's gloves had rested earlier. A melted candle had dripped slightly, leaving a residue that might have been dismissed by anyone else. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The angle, the height, the placement, it was deliberate, and it linked in a subtle but undeniable way to another observation he had made, the careful positioning of the decanter, the untouched glass, and the indentation in the armchair. The criminal was meticulous, precise, and aware that each action was observed. Poirot walked slowly to the fireplace, touching the empty hearth where the fragments had once been. He recalled the burnt note, the charred paper, the tiny phrases preserved in his memory. After the funeral, consequences, reclaim what is owed. The words were not random. They were instructions, a plan executed with deliberate timing, echoing across decades of hidden debts and grudges. And now, with Mrs. Pennington's disappearance, it became clear. The murderer sought to manipulate attention, to redirect suspicion, and to control the sequence of discovery. His gaze shifted to the mantelpiece above the fireplace, where a family photograph had been slightly tilted, though no one had noticed at the time. The tilt was minor, barely perceptible, yet it corresponded precisely to the time when Mrs. Pennington had been absent from the room, providing a clue to her movement and, more importantly, her proximity to the scene of the original crime. Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. The criminal had left these traces intentionally, or perhaps unknowingly, but each contributed to a pattern that now revealed itself. He called the household together once more, speaking with calm authority. "Mes amis, we have been misled by appearances, by clever diversions and by fear. But notice this, small habits, minor adjudge, ostments, little touches, all reveal more than one intends. The tilt of a photograph, the residue of wax, the positioning of objects, these are not accidents. They form a sequence, a rhythm, a pattern that points unmistakably to the orchestration of events." Poirot paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He then addressed each person by turn, watching their faces as he did so. "Consider the gloves, the decanter, the chair. Each of these was touched, moved, or positioned with awareness, yet each left a trace. Some traces were subtle, almost invisible, but they speak. They tell us who handled them, how, and, most importantly, why." Miss Marsh's eyes flickered briefly, as if a small fragment of panic had crossed her usually composed expression. Graves, rigid and formal, stiffened slightly, though his hands were still folded. Elsie's grip on her apron loosened, as if a breath she had been holding for hours finally escaped. Poirot allowed the silence to deepen. The human response to subtle exposure was more revealing than overt questioning. It left cracks, and through those cracks the truth began to emerge. He returned to the hearth, imagining the sequence of events, the precise timing, the deliberate choreography of actions. The murder, the theft of the fragments, the disappearance, they were not chaotic at all. They were part of a plan, executed with foresight and cunning, and the clues had been in plain sight all along, only waiting for the right mind to perceive their interrelation. Poirot straightened, tapping his cane lightly against the floor. The pattern was no longer hidden. The timing, the objects, the movements, and the subtle psychological signals all aligned into a coherent sequence. The perpetrator had believed themselves invisible, untouchable, orchestrating events from the shadows. Yet the pattern, the rhythm of human action and reaction, had betrayed them. He faced the assembled household with calm intensity. The threads are now visible. The past, the present, the objects, the gestures, all converge into a single design. The truth is no longer scattered, it is complete, and it is within reach. Now we can see the full picture, and the final revelation will be undeniable. In that moment, the tension in the room became palpable. The criminal, unseen, had unknowingly signaled their own undoing, and Poirot, ever patient, was ready to follow the pattern to its conclusion. Poirot remained standing, his gaze sweeping over the anxious faces before him, the room charged with expectation. The pieces had fallen into place, the patterns, the timing, the subtle psychological signs, but the motive, he realized, had remained elusive, obscured by layers of greed, resentment, and fear. What had driven the murderer to orchestrate such an elaborate scheme, to manipulate the household so cunningly, and to strike with such precision? The answer, Poirot knew, would be far more unsettling than mere inheritance or spite. He began methodically, speaking slowly, his voice calm yet deliberate, compelling attention. "Mes amis, we have observed the manipulation, the careful orchestration of events, and the courage, or recklessness, of the criminal who believes themselves invisible. But one must ask, why? Why go to such lengths? Why plan a death after a funeral, leave false trails, steal evidence, and now disappear into shadows, leaving fear in their wake?" The room remained silent, each occupant hanging on his words. Poirot turned toward Mrs. Pennington, whose composure now faltered under his unyielding gaze. "It is not merely desire for wealth, nor simple revenge for past slights. Observe carefully. Consider the sequence of actions, the timing of the death, the manipulation of evidence, the deliberate creation of a false culprit. Each act display. A mind that craves control above all else. A mind that must dictate events, witness outcomes, and most importantly, bend others to its will. He paced slowly, his cane tapping rhythmically against the floor as though marking the cadence of thought. Monsieur Jameson, consider the psychology here. The criminal's satisfaction is not derived from gain or vengeance alone. It is derived from the exertion of power over people, from orchestrating fear and obedience. The murder, the theft, the disappearance, they are instruments, each carefully designed to demonstrate control, to manipulate reality itself. Poirot paused, allowing the weight of his observations to settle over the room. And here is the most shocking element. The criminal's actions are not reactions to circumstances. They are compulsions born from a psyche that delights in meticulous planning, that cannot abide disorder, and that finds pleasure in testing the moral and intellectual limits of others. This is a mind that will stop at nothing to achieve its version of perfection, even if it means death. Mrs. Pennington shifted uncomfortably. Poirot's gaze, unflinching, fell upon her gloves, the subtle traces of wax, and the faint residue that had betrayed her earlier movements. Consider, too, the personal stakes, he continued. A desire for wealth and position might motivate one to act swiftly, recklessly. But the criminal here has demonstrated patience, forethought, and calculation beyond mere greed. Each act has been executed to evoke maximum psychological impact. A murder after morning, evidence removed to mislead, suspense cultivated among those present. These are not the actions of an ordinary criminal. They are the expressions of a mind intoxicated by control and precision. Miss Marsh's eyes widened subtly, a flicker of understanding or fear passing across her face. Poirot continued methodically, Ying bear the connections between past grievances and present actions. The debts, the old injustices, the unresolved disputes, all these provided opportunity, context, and pretext. But the underlying motive, the force that compelled these extreme measures, was the desire to assert dominance over circumstance, over people, and over time itself. The criminal is playing a game in which they are both conductor and audience, and they cannot tolerate interruption. He let the words hang, then lowered his voice, emphasizing the gravity of the revelation. It is a chilling realization, n'est-ce pas? The villain is not motivated simply by material gain. They are motivated by the need to demonstrate that they can dictate events, control minds, and impose order through fear and meticulous planning. This explains the vanishing evidence, the careful staging, the subtle psychological manipulations. It is not to conceal alone, but to exert power, to orchestrate the response of others, and to confirm mastery over life itself. Poirot stepped back, folding his hands. The room was silent, the faces pale, understanding dawning like a candle flame. And so, mes amis, he concluded, the crime is far more sinister than it first appeared. It is not about money. It is not about revenge. It is about a mind that thrives on manipulation, that delights in control, and that will go to extremes unimaginable to ordinary men. The motive is psychological, profound, and terrifyingly personal. He allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of this revelation settle. And now that we understand the motive, the pattern, and the psychology, we can anticipate the next move. The criminal may still be several steps ahead, but every step leaves a trace. Every action is governed by the same compulsive need for control, and it is this need, above all, that will guide us to uncover the final truth. The tension in room was palpable, the household collectively realizing that they had been enmeshed in a web far more intricate and unnerving than anyone had imagined. Poirot, calm and composed as ever, felt the thrill of the approaching resolution. The last pieces were in place, and the mind behind the crimes would soon be revealed. The manor was silent, the night outside heavy with fog that pressed against the windows like a living presence. Poirot had spent the hours since his revelation methodically preparing, not with haste, but with the patient precision that characterized every aspect of his work. The pattern was clear, the psychology understood, and the traces of the criminal's compulsive need for control had guided him to a single conclusion. It was time for the final confrontation. He gathered the household in the drawing-room once more, a pretense of calm masking the tension that crackled in the air. "Mes amis," he said softly, "the truth no longer hides. Every action has left its trace, every gesture has spoken, and every small deviation from perfection has betrayed the criminal among us. Tonight we shall resolve this matter." Mrs. Pennington remained outwardly composed, though Poirot noted the ever-so-slight tremor of her fingers and the flicker of anxiety in her eyes. He allowed the silence to stretch, giving weight to his words, letting the psychological pressure accumulate. He turned toward her directly, his dark eyes fixed with unyielding intensity. "Madame, you have been meticulous, patient, and careful. You believed that you could orchestrate events, manipulate responses, and remain unseen. But your need for control, your subtle compulsions, have revealed themselves." A pause. Mrs. Pennington's lips pressed tightly together. Her breathing was steady, yet Poirot observed the smallest quiver at the corners of her eyes. "You misunderstand me," she said, her voice company, controlled, yet edged with tension. "I am not guilty of—" "Ah, but the evidence is clear," Poirot interrupted gently, though with a firmness that left no room for evasion. He gestured to the desk, the armchair, the decanter, and the now empty hearth where the fragments had been stolen. "The pattern, the movements, the residue of wax, the subtle traces of poison, everything points to you. Your psychological need to orchestrate, to control, has guided every act. Even the disappearance of yourself, or the appearance thereof, was part of the choreography." Mrs. Pennington's composure cracked slightly. She stepped back toward the door, a fleeting movement that was nearly imperceptible, yet Poirot's sharp eye caught it. "Do not attempt to flee, madame," he said, his tone calm yet commanding. "You will gain nothing, and your control, so carefully exercised, has been observed at every step. Every action has left a trace, every decision betrayed you, and now the trap is complete." She inhaled sharply, her eyes darting toward the window, then to the darkened hallways. For a moment it seemed she might attempt a desperate escape, but Poirot, anticipating this, had ensured that every exit was monitored. Her plan, meticulous as it had been, had overlooked the constancy of observation, the patient vigilance that he alone maintained. Poirot continued, lowering his voice slightly, drawing her in with the weight of inevitability. "You believed your motive, your desire to assert control over life, over death, over the reactions of others, would remain hidden. But we have traced every subtlety, every unconscious sign, the timing of Charles's death, the manipulation of evidence, the psychological pressure you exerted on others. Everything reveals the truth. And now, faced with this clarity, you must confront your own actions." Mrs. Pennington's shoulders slumped slightly, the first overt sign of surrender. Her voice trembled as she spoke, almost a whisper. You understand everything?" Poirot inclined his head. "Oui, madame. I have observed the pattern, I have understood the motive, and I have traced every movement and every trace that you believed would remain invisible. The game is over. The control you sought to exercise through fear and manipulation is at an end." For a moment, the room was suspended in silence, the tension like a taut wire vibrating between them. Then, slowly, Mrs. Pennington exhaled, her hands falling to her sides, her eyes downcast. The carefully constructed facade of control had crumbled under the relentless scrutiny of observation, deduction, and psychological insight. She had no path left but confession or arrest, and she knew it. Poirot stepped closer, his cane tapping softly against the floor. "The law, Monsieur Jameson, will now take its course. And yet, we have learned much, not only of the crime, but of the human mind, its compulsions, and the ways in which desire for control can drive one to extremes." Inspector Jameson moved forward to secure Mrs. Pennington, and the household exhaled collectively, the tension finally dissipating. Poirot remained composed, his dark eyes reflective, knowing that the culmination of observation, deduction, and subtle psychological insight had resolved the labyrinthine mystery. The night outside pressed against the manor, but within, the shadows had receded, and the truth, patient and unerring, had finally emerged. The manor, though quiet now in the immediate aftermath of Mrs. Pennington's confession, retained a charged atmosphere. The household had begun to relax, convinced that the tangled web of deceit had been fully unravelled. Inspector Jameson had secured Mrs. Pennington and was preparing to transport her to the station, while Poirot lingered in the drawing-room, reviewing the sequence events in his mind. The pattern was elegant, the motives laid bare, and the culprit apprehended, or so it seemed. Poirot's eyes drifted toward the hearth, where the remnants of the earlier chaos had once been most evident. It was there, in the very spot that had been disturbed so often, the charred fragments, the vanished note, the wax residue, that a tiny, almost imperceptible anomaly caught his attention, a single faint smudge on the corner of the mantelpiece, overlooked in every previous examination. His heart quickened, for in that small imperfection lay the seed of doubt. He retrieved his magnifying glass and studied it carefully. The smear was not accidental, it was deliberate, subtle, and formed an almost imperceptible fingerprint pattern that did not match Mrs. Pennington's gloves or anyone else previously considered. Poirot's mind raced, tracing every action, every subtle psychological trace, every minor detail he had observed. Something, or someone, had been hiding in plain sight, observing the entire investigation, confident that even the most careful scrutiny would fail to detect them. Poirot motioned to Jameson, drawing him closer. "Mon ami, we must pause before declaring the matter resolved. There is one final detail, a final element that suggests our previous conclusions, though correct in part, do not account for the entire orchestration." The inspector frowned. "You mean someone else?" Poirot inclined his head. "We. Consider the meticulous timing, the anticipation of reactions, the disappearance of Mrs. Pennington herself, and the vanishing of evidence. All these elements required not only careful planning, but also an intimate knowledge of the household and of the investigation itself. Someone else has been guiding events from the shadows, even as we focused on the visible culprit. He called the household back together, insisting on calm but attentive observation. Eyes followed him as he approached the mantelpiece, where the faint smear remained, almost mocking in its subtlety. "Mes amis, the game is not yet finished. There is another mind, one even more careful, more patient, and perhaps more sinister than the one we have just confronted." He turned slowly to inspect each person, watching faces carefully. Miss Marsh's composure was impeccable, yet Poirot caught the briefest flicker of calculation behind her eyes. Graves's rigid posture concealed little, but there was a subtle tension in his hands. Even Elsie, usually timid, appeared unusually alert, as if anticipating his revelation. Poirot's gaze lingered on each, finally settling on the solicitor, who had remained quietly at the edge of the room, his expression polite but unreadable. "It is most striking," Poirot continued, "that the final act, the removal of the note fragments, the subtle manipulations that led to Mrs. Pennington's confession, required insight not merely into human behavior, but into the progress of our investigation itself. Only one person had such access and such knowledge, the solicitor. He moved with discretion, observing, calculating, and guiding the unfolding events while remaining seemingly neutral. A hush fell over the room. The solicitor shifted slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his otherwise composed face. Poirot smiled faintly, aware that he had drawn out the last thread with precision. "You see, mes amis, the crime was not confined to a single act of murder. It was a performance, a sequence designed to test not only morality, but intellect. Mrs. Pennington was the instrument, the visible participant, but the true conductor, the mind that orchestrated subtleties, controlled timing, and ensured the manipulations, remained just beyond suspicion. Was this gentleman here?" The solicitor's lips tightened. For a moment, the air was tea, with unspoken tension, as if the final act of exposure threatened to collapse the delicate equilibrium of appearances. Poirot's eyes never wavered. "You underestimated human observation," he said softly, "and you overestimated your invisibility. Every movement, every carefully placed distraction, every psychological nudge you orchestrated has left a trace. And now the final revelation is inevitable." The solicitor's hand twitched, and it was clear he contemplated a sudden, desperate move, but Poirot, prepared for such an eventuality, had already anticipated it. With a slight motion to Jameson, The inspector moved forward, securing the solicitor before he could act. The last-minute twist, the true mastermind hidden behind the apparent culprit, had been exposed, and the final layer of the intricate crime had been brought into the light. Poirot stepped back, folding his hands, his expression serene yet triumphant. The web of deceit, spanning past grievances, psychological compulsions, and deliberate manipulations, had been unraveled completely. The house, heavy with tension only moments before, now felt the first tentative release of order, as the final truth had been laid bare. The criminal, clever, patient, and dangerous, was finally accounted for, and Poirot, as ever, had anticipated, observed, and revealed the genius behind the deception. The manner was unusually still as Inspector Jameson led the solicitor away, his steps measured, his composure betraying none of the internal shock that rippled through the household. Poirot remained in the drawing-room, the soft lamplight illuminating the sharp planes of his face, his mind tracing every detail that had led to this moment. The sequence of deception, the carefully constructed motives, and the labyrinthine orchestration of events had finally been exposed. Yet, as always, Poirot's satisfaction was tempered by a awareness of subtle imperfections, the faintest threads that might still conceal unseen truths. He moved slowly through the room, pausing before the mantelpiece, where the faint wax smear and the corner of the hearth had revealed the hidden hand of the true mastermind. "Observe," he said, turning to the remaining members of the household, "how even the smallest details, the seemingly inconsequential marks, led to the unmasking of those who believed themselves invisible. The tilt of a photograph, the residue of gloves, the manipulation of objects, all were traces deliberately left, consciously or not, and all were observed and interpreted."
Miss Marsh, seated quietly in a corner, nodded slightly. She had watched Poirot at work for hours, her respect tempered by an unease she could not entirely disguise. "And yet, Monsieur Poirot," she ventured, "do you believe the entire truth has been revealed? Could there still be more?" Poirot smiled faintly, steepling his fingers. "It is always possible, mademoiselle, that the human mind contains complexities even I have not fully accounted for. But the criminal who sought to control events, to manipulate outcomes, and to conceal their actions, has been exposed. Justice, in the sense of law and moral reckoning, has been served." He gestured toward the spot where Mrs. Pennington had stood, her own motivations now fully revealed in the prior confrontation. Madame was driven by a desire to assert dominance, to control circumstances and people, and she acted under the influence of a hidden psychological imperative. Yet she was guided, manipulated, and observed by another, more patient mind, one that remained in the shadows until now. The solicitor's involvement was the final unexpected twist, demonstrating how a secondary hand can amplify deception, how appearances can mislead even the most attentive observer. Inspector Jameson, still slightly shaken, asked, "So all the evidence we collected, every trace, every inconsistency was part of a deliberate game to misdirect us?" "Exactement," Poirot replied. "But observe how it was nonetheless insufficient. Every act, no matter how cunning, leaves a mark, physical, behavioral, psychological. The criminal underestimates the power of observation, of reasoning, and of deduction. They believe their control absolute, but the small, seemingly insignificant deviations betray them. A tremor of the hand, the hesitation in speech, a mark on the furniture, these are the instruments of revelation." He moved toward the hearth, recalling the moments when the fragments of the charred note had first vanished. "Consider this, the removal of evidence, the careful staging, the manipulations, all intended to obscure, yet they themselves became evidence, leaving a trail only perceptible to the patient observer. The sequence of events, once arranged with understanding of human behavior and historical grudges, became transparent." Poirot looked at each member of the household, his gaze penetrating yet calm. "And so, mes amis, justice has been delivered. Yet one must acknowledge a certain uneasiness. For while the visible culprits have been apprehended, the depth of human cunning is vast. The shadows of ambition, of obsession, and of control linger. One may have been caught, but the echoes of manipulation serve as a reminder,
Vigilance, observation, and reasoning are never complete until all traces are accounted for. He straightened, leaning lightly on his cane. The lesson is clear. Crime may appear clever, intricate, and even unstoppable, but the smallest details, the subtlest deviations from perfection, are the keys to understanding. The mind that orchestrates with hubris will always leave traces, and it is the patient, the observant, and the deductive who shall ultimately prevail. Justice, then, has been served, though the memory of the shadows remains, a quiet testament to the complexities of human nature. The household, though relieved, felt the weight of his words. There was closure, yet also a lingering awareness of the subtle manipulations, the clever orchestration, and the reminder that human cunning could never be entirely foreseen. Poirot, as always, had revealed the hidden threads, leaving no question unexamined, no subtlety unobserved, and no deception unchallenged. Justice had been done, yet the mind of the detective remained alert, already attuned to the next shadow that might emerge in the quiet corners of the world. The fog had lifted slightly outside Greystone Manor, revealing a pale moon that cast silvery light across the damp garden paths. Poirot stood at the entrance, his coat drawn tightly against the chill, observing the last of the household apart in the wake of the evening's revelations. Inspector Jameson had taken the solicitor and Mrs. Pennington into custody, and the rest of the family and staff moved quietly, their faces a mixture of relief and lingering unease. The immediate danger had passed, yet the manor itself seemed to breathe a quiet tension, as if acknowledging that, while one mystery had concluded, the echoes of intrigue never truly faded. Poirot adjusted his hat and stepped onto the gravel drive, the sound of his cane tapping rhythmically against the stone. His mind, always active, reviewed the intricate sequence of events that had unfolded. The first shocking death, the disappearance of evidence, the psychological manipulations, and the unexpected revelation of the solicitor's hidden role. Every action, every subtle cue, every seemingly trivial object had been significant. And yet, there remained one detail, small and almost insignificant, that gnawed at him, a slight smudge on the edge of the study window, unnoticed by anyone but him, its purpose and origin still unclear. He paused, letting the evening air fill his lungs, and considered the implication. Was it an innocent trace left by chance, or was it a signal, a hidden communication from someone who had observed the investigation with equal cunning? Poirot's sharp eyes traced the outline of the window frame, the faint scuff marks in the dust, and the shadows cast by the fading lamplight. The detail seemed trivial to anyone else, yet in his experience, trivialities often carried the gravest meaning. Even when the overt criminal is caught, Poirot murmured to himself, the universe has a way of reminding us that the mind capable of deception may leave hints beyond comprehension. He smiled faintly at the thought. The pursuit of truth was never a straight path. It was a labyrinth of signs, signals, and subtle revelations, each layer revealing the depth of human cunning and the resilience of observation. As he began walking down the drive toward the gate, he recalled the cryptic messages, the minor manipulations, and the fleeting expressions that had been almost imperceptible to others. Each had contributed to the unraveling of the case, yet one or two had never quite aligned perfectly with the conclusions drawn. He knew, instinctively, that these lingering irregularities were not flaws in deduction. They were invitations, gentle nudges from fate, suggesting that the world held more mysteries, always just beyond reach. Poirot's pace was measured, his ain tapping in time with the rhythm of his thoughts. The manor receded behind him, its windows darkened, the corners of its rooms empty and silent. He reflected on the human motives revealed: greed, control, revenge, psychological compulsion. But he also considered the subtle artistry of misdirection, the elegant dance between truth and concealment. It was a game he had mastered, yet one he knew would never truly end, for human nature was inexhaustible in its capacity for secrecy. As he approached the gate, he paused, lifting his gaze to the horizon, where the first stars of evening sparkled faintly. The last whisper of the unresolved detail, that enigmatic smudge, seemed to pulse in his memory like a heartbeat. Poirot smiled knowingly, not with triumph, but with the quiet anticipation of a detective who understood that the pursuit of truth was eternal. One case concluded, another always waited. Justice, mes amis, he murmured softly to the night, is a step in a longer journey. The shadows of deceit retreat for now, yet they are never vanquished entirely. There is always another puzzle, another mind to unravel, another truth to uncover. And with that, Poirot continued down the path, disappearing into the mist, his silhouette small but unwavering, a solitary figure forever attuned to the faintest traces of human cunning. Behind him, Greystone Manor settled into stillness, the echoes of revelation lingering in its corridors, and in the mind of anyone who might one day return to discover that mysteries, no matter how thoroughly solved, never truly end.